Okay, so we have the host of Toy Division podcast. If you've never heard of it or heard it, I would suggest checking it out. They talk about a lot of cool stuff, a lot of graffiti stuff, but then the host, who is going to remain nameless, which that's another cool thing about their podcast, is that they don't say the name, so there's some kind of like mystery there, like who is this person they're talking to, stuff like that. But there's some cool episodes on there. Like I like the episode that you did where you talked about sleep and stuff. So it's cool to hear, a graffiti podcast where you guys are diving into some other stuff. So the reason that we have the Toy Division host on the show today is because he and I had some cool discussions, and I was on his show, and he knows a lot about the brain and psychology and neuroscience and things like that. And so the topic today that we wanted to discuss it's kind of a broad topic, but it's how often the journey is often more rewarding and enjoyable than the actual end result. But we'll probably fly off onto some different topics. So I'll stop rambling and welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, mate. That was a nice introduction as well. I think people find it difficult if I ever talk on someone else's show. They go to say like the name that's on the screen, and they're like, the Toy Division guy or the Toy Division person, because that's a big thing that I wanted to achieve with Toy Division. And if anyone was wondering where the name comes from, it's a reference to a band that's originally from the UK. Now, most people have kind of guessed it, but I think there's probably a generation of people who wouldn't know who that band is. So it's not exactly more complex than just Googling it, but my real push for it has been this anonymous, as you said, a bit of mystery, because I think there's so many great podcasts out there, F24, Bench Talk, Legends Thursday, which was the first one. Shout out to Legends Thursday, which was the first podcast I ever found about graffiti. The Graffiti Machine, like you were saying, you've had some cool stuff. Well, we've had some cool stuff. I say we. I haven't got a production team. It's just me in my spare room. But the Graffiti Machine for me has been a really interesting one because I really like the way it's gone off on topics beyond just the standard kind of like tell me a story about a mission or tell me a story about the paint that you use or that type of stuff. I think there's so much more scope to talking about graffiti and then how it can be a bit more of a mature adult activity that can give so much more back because it's given a lot to me. Okay, it hasn't always been positive in terms of like criminal justice stuff and, the things which living a life where you're maybe doing illegal things and it can be very much a gateway crime. But, being a graffiti writer is something now which I feel is like in my DNA, and finding your podcast and listening to you and, Cup talking and a lot about the stoicism and really trying to just not be an asshole really when you're a writer. I don't know about you, but I've met a lot of writers who are not exactly the nicest, most welcoming people. So it's always good to know there's other people out there who do positive stuff. And one of the really interesting things I've heard you discuss previously is, how your own kind of business and organization that you're setting up to really give back to the community and change that very often negative viewpoint of graffiti, because it's often seen as this mindless vandalism, which happens. But as I'm sure we're going to go in today, it's way more complex and people are complex and the world is complex. And I would always hope with my podcast that I can make people realize that just because you're like a little bit mentally unwell or you've got addiction issues or you've experienced trauma or any of that type of stuff, that's not a sign that you're just a weak person. You're not a failure in your life. You're a human being. And the only hope we've really got is to understand that about ourselves and others. So that was a long blurb, but I hope that gives a bit of an idea.
No, it's all good. Yeah, I think it is cool to put out that kind of information to people. A lot of the stuff that you were talking about, I've listened to a bunch of your episodes. I haven't listened to all of them, but quite a few. And I do like that you put out that stuff and you you talk about addiction and things like that. And I think that stuff's helpful for people to, just to hear that someone else is dealing with it and then the way that you spin it.
The reason why I feel quite comfortable talking about addiction and mental health and that type of stuff is, and I think I've brushed on some of this in some of the episodes, until 5 or so years ago, I was a drug addict and an alcoholic, and I've had mental health problems since I was about 11 years old. And that was always something which I felt that people needed to realize that addiction and mental health and physical health is all interrelated. But then through my job, which I got as an occupational therapist, so people often don't know what that actually means, but occupational therapy, essentially, to break it down super quick, is it's helping people to do the things they need to do, they want to do, or they're expected to do. So that can basically be anything. So things I need to do is I need to get up, I need to have a shower, I need to brush my teeth, I need to pay my rent. Want to do, normally sit on the sofa, eat some Doritos, although I'm trying not to eat as many Doritos because I know they're not exactly very healthy. Go and paint. I went out to see some friends last night. We hung out, sketched, all that type of stuff. So that's what I want to do. And then what I'm expected to do is, work, not throw punches at people on the street, all these things. And they all kind of overlap. And then people think, well, that's what the term occupation means. Then if you have a physical health issue, a mental health issue, you have an accident, trauma, it could be anything. Your ability to engage in those occupations at any stage in your life, you can be a child. There's occupational therapists that work in hospitals with babies that have just been born to help them to start moving. And then people that work in aged care, elderly people might need help. I'm working with a guy at the moment who's late 60s, and I'm helping him to get equipment in his house so that he can be as independent as possible, because he's got people coming to his house and helping him to wash and dress. But if we make some changes to his environment and change his ability to do things through occupational therapy, then he'll be able to be more independent. And we don't really realize how lucky we are, or maybe 2020 has taught a lot of people, all the things we take for granted. Because that's what I say to people: if you take all these things for granted, going out, seeing our friends, having money for rent, having a job, all those things, and then it can get taken away by something, even like a global pandemic. And then suddenly everyone's like, oh, so what's really meaningful is things which bring me fulfillment, not necessarily chasing money, because money is quite a never-ending hamster wheel. And what I'm doing, without even realizing, I'm segueing into today's subject. So I have a habit of doing that as well. I just talk, and then eventually it gets to today's subject.
That's cool, man. I do like, I thought about what you were talking about, how we take a lot of things for granted. And I kind of went pretty far into that. And this is a little off topic for what we're going to talk about, but I think it's somewhat related. Like, well, not really, but I'll just say it anyway. But I was even thinking, like, when I was grabbing a cup of coffee, and I'm like, dude, I even take for granted that I have a hand. You know what I mean? Like, how crazy it is that your brain sends these signals down your fucking nervous system and your hand opens and closes and shit. Like, there's people that can't do that, So when you're talking about taking for granted of stuff like, going out with your friends and stuff, people even take for granted that, like, you have the ability to wipe your own ass, and some of the people that you're dealing with, like, they have to have somebody do that for them, so it's kind of crazy that so many things could be taken away from us so easily. So, I mean, I think that is a good perspective to have to just be grateful for everything that you have. The fact that you can move your toes, like, there's people that are laying in hospital beds that would love to just be able to wiggle their fucking toes,
It's something which I don't think I'd appreciated before I did the undergraduate degree. So you have to go to university. People often say, well, occupational therapy, that just sounds like you just do stuff. Do you just go do like a weekend course? And you're like, no, you need to go do a proper university degree. But it took about a year and a half, 2 years for me to even understand what the term occupation actually meant, because it's such a obviously clear thing. but you don't realize how every single thing in our life is so important. And when that's taken away, like you were just saying, I was actually talking to some friends last night, and we were talking about the occurrence that apparently someone turned up at a wall, and they're like, and I've done this before when I used to drink, I still drink, but not anywhere near as much. Like turn up at the wall, it's like, this cap doesn't work, and this outline colour's shit. What the fuck? I don't want to do this. And I'd like lay on the floor and I'm going to McDonald's, stuff this. And then I just said to my mates, I was like, when people do that, you just think, you're just lucky to even be able to hold the spray can in your hand and to be able to actually press the flipping nozzle. Like that's the levels you get to where you're like, yeah. And and I think you summed it up really well. Your hand works. You can walk. I can hear. I can see. We can talk now. We're talking through the flipping internet. But we're so used to taking things for granted. And, the grass is always greener is a common term. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. What's it, the song? You don't know what you've got till it's gone. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. And people are like, oh, you're Green Party lefty now, are you? And I'm like, well, yeah, I am. But I guess it's that thing we don't really realise how important all those component parts of our life actually are, because often we're led to believe through many quite subtle prompts, clear, subconscious, subversive type prompts, that actually the meaning of things that are important are often things which are very brief and very, I would probably say, empty. So there's a great book. And what I really like about your podcast is you guys would often, and probably still do, good books called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts by someone by the name of Gabor Mate. That's Gabor and then Mate. And that's all about close encounters with addiction. But there's the term, but hungry ghost. And sorry to anyone that's a practicing Buddhist, but I believe a hungry ghost is a Buddhist term for a being that needs external stimulation to feel kind of like full, or to feel that there's something happening of positivity. And if you think about that as external stimulus, that's how we end up developing repeated use patterns, otherwise known as addictions. So for whatever reason, we might need to check our phone every 5 or 10 minutes, or every, I think when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, we were talking about people stopping, including me. I've had to work on this, checking their phone when they stop at a set of traffic lights. And, it's that external stimulus. So it could be drugs, alcohol, gambling, exercise can become a habit, shopping, like those kind of often pushed as at work. We know the term a workaholic. We're getting that external stimulus to try and fill this void which exists in us. And this is Buddhist thinking from pretty crap. I don't really know. I'm guessing like a long time, probably 1,000+ years of Buddhist thinking. But philosophers have been talking about this type of stuff for thousands of years. I got a little book that I've got sitting in front of me, and it was a philosopher by the name of Seneca. And the title of the book is Seneca on the Shortness of Life. Life is long if you know how to use it. And I think it's just this thing where you kind of get to this point where, making quite a lot of money. I don't know about you. I think you mentioned it on a different episode. You get to that point where you're actually quite well off. And, I didn't come from a family where we had much money. And then you get to that point where you've got money, but you're working your absolute balls off. And you're just bloody miserable. I was anyway.
Yeah. A lot of people, that's like a common thing to hear, that, and I guess that's totally related to what we were originally going to talk about, which is, once you start to get to that point, I guess once you start getting the money, I guess it's a little bit of a somewhat related, but my company's doing pretty well right now, but the amount of time that I'm putting in is ridiculous. Like the amount of stress that it's taking to get it to that point. So right now, a lot of my effort is going into getting the right people in place to kind of free me up to do the stuff that's important. I read in a book called Clockwork that's it's about getting your business focused on what they call the queen bee role, which is, I won't get too far into it, but it's like, the queen bee has one job is to produce eggs, and then the rest of the hive is supposed to protect that one role. So you look at your business in that way. And the idea is to try to free yourself up so that your business can be successful without you being there. So then hopefully I'm trying to get off. I'm not really motivated by money, but I do have a lot of things that I want to do. Dog rescue, give back to the graph culture and things like that I know I can do a lot of it with money. So I'm really careful to not be pursuing this money. But I think to segue into the topic we were talking about, which is sort of not forgetting to, well, I guess some people don't realize this, and I didn't really know it until I heard it, which is that your brain gives you rewards for accomplishing things in the process in pursuit of what you're going for. And my understanding is it's something that's wired into us. So, back before when we were pretty much one with the animals and nature and shit, your brain gives you dopamine releases as you're accomplishing shit on your goal. So say, for example, you're sort of tuned into knowing what signs to look for in nature to know that you're on the right path towards something like water or whatever. There's like certain plants you're like, okay, this plant only grows near water or some shit like that. So your brain will reward you in order to keep you excited about being on that path, or maybe excited isn't the word, but so I think it's an interesting topic, because when I think about certain times in my graph career, like there's one date, 1993, that anytime I see any reference to 1993, I get like this sort of good feeling, because I was really starting to find my way at that point. So I could talk more about that later, but I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on just that topic in general. So whatever you want to talk about in that regard.
As you were talking, I was quickly scribbling down some points, because what you're talking about there, we're talking about before we were living in what could be described as, I heard it described the other day as the majority of human civilization is basically living in a giant zoo, really. We're living in an environment where it does not match our ancestral evolution.
Yeah.
We would live in small groups, living in nature, surviving from day to day. This idea that you would need to eat 3 times a day. A lot of the whole thing of breakfast is the most important meal of the day. That's most likely come from the cereal industry, where they want you to make sure you eat lots of morning cereals, which normally, but especially in the US, I have been to the US before, and I remember looking at some of the ingredients of the cereal and being like,
fuck that shit.
A lot of sugar in this.
Yeah, stay the fuck out of the cereal.
I used to eat bucket loads of that when I was a kid, because my mum was like, oh, this is healthy. It's heart healthy. But anyway, I'm going off the slight thing, but I guess what you were talking about is we are rewarded for certain things. We are rewarded by neurotransmitters and hormones. So neurotransmitters, there's a real big variety of them. So, we're talking about dopamine, oxytocin, adrenaline, cortisol, all that type of stuff. And what they actually are is they're things that help transmission between a neuron. So a neuron is a cell, and very often a brain cell. The majority of your brain cells are neurons. And the things that connect those together are synapses. So I've heard it described very well before is neurons are like a website, and the synapse is the URL link, linking it together. But what the communication that's required to be, because it's all basically electrical impulses. So we are a lot electric. That's a whole other subject, but just to break it down. So neurotransmitters are released when we're doing certain things, and they can be excitatory, if I can pronounce it right. So it can give you kind of more energy or more buzz, or they can be down-regulating. So a bit more calming. You've got things like GABA, not the music. If anyone knows what GABA music is, that's definitely not calming. So what you're saying is that, what you're saying quite rightly so, is we are rewarded for doing certain things. Otherwise, what would be the biological drive to do anything? Why would we be interested in mating or finding food or finding shelter or finding safety? It's not just because we want to do it. Our neurotransmitters are going, oh yeah, you should do that. You should do that. You should do that. That's good. And also realizing that our stress response, which relates very much into this, so the autonomic nervous system, your stress response in an ancestral context was there to kind of teach us, like, if you walk down this one path, like you were saying, that path with that water, and on the way to that path, there's a flipping thing kind of moving in the grass. And it looks a little bit like a snake. That can be quite dangerous. If we see that, our nervous system starts to wire this idea that maybe that path of that part of that path is not probably the best thing. Or if we've been to an area where there's big cats, that was one of our biggest predators from an evolutionary perspective, giant cats, lions, tigers, panthers, they would be very much preying on us as humans, and we would know as a group, probably before real language developed, being in an area where there's giant cats, we would probably need to be aware as a group to keep ourselves safe. this is not an area we want to live in because there's loads of giant bloody panthers around here. But if you could imagine, they would have been short, sharp bits of stress. So it would have been that sympathetic nervous system. You know, people call it fight, flight. There's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So fight, flight, so run away or fight it. Freeze, too much, you kind of freeze, like rabbit in the headlights type thing. Or you can have fawn. So that's the newest one they've put in recently, is this idea that in a social context, because we're incredibly social beings, one of the most sociable animals on the whole planet. That's why we've been so successful. We're actually quite rubbish compared to a lot of other animals. Like, we can't take on a gorilla, they'll smash us to bits. We can't take on a flipping elephant, they'll crush us. We can't take on a hippopotamus because they'll just eat us. Can't take on so many, but we work really well together in groups. And that link that we have together and that working as a group is our biggest power. So I guess it's an interesting one, because segueing to where we're going, so I'm now talking about flipping evolution, like all this stuff which we're, the drive for more, the drive for more, the drive for more, like exercise. That's why exercise is being found is now so potentially beneficial for not just mental health, because that's pretty much done and dusted. And again, science is never proven. This is what people don't get. They don't do a study and a research and then things are proven. Science is always testing hypotheses. And anyone that says, oh, well, I've seen this one study and that proves this, they don't really understand what research studies are. So, you know, that push for that drive and us kind of making progress around the world. But the problem is that the environment's changed. So our actual stressors, you know, like I was mentioning before, is those short, sharp pieces of stress, it would like you'd be fight off the cat or run away or something like that, and then you'd be able to then just relax. But in modern life, we've got this constant stressor, this chronic, persistent stress, emails, text messages, people cutting you up in traffic, that type of stuff. And often we may not have had the ability to get the input from our parents when we're younger, or our immediate caregivers, that helps us to what's called self-regulate. So then that constant drive for more, yeah, that's a basic human need. But then if we link that back to what I was talking about, that perception of hungry ghost, you know, us needing that stimulus, us needing that, oh, I've got to check Instagram, I've got to get my likes, I've got to go and have that beer after work. Because the thing is, with the external stimulus, it helps us feel calm and regulated for a little bit of time, but doesn't really last very long. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is, you know, we're talking about that constant quest for more and maybe not always feeling that, oh, I've achieved enough. But the really important thing to realize is that they're actually quite like the goals which are often pushed by society. And we can talk about why that's pushed by society, but they're often like achieve more, work more. It's very godly to work a lot. You know, you can get in some religions, it's like the more you work, the more money you earn, the closer you get to God. But actually, then people burn themselves out. And what really, really brings us connection and feeling of wellness on the inside is when we're not chasing dopamine. So we're not chasing that, oh, I'm going to get a short dopamine hit. Because again, the thing is with dopamine receptors in your brain and your nervous system is eventually they stop being so reactive. So you need more and more and more and more and more stimulus. That's why, I don't know, first time someone does cocaine, they feel a huge buzz. And then they're doing it every day and they need more and more and more and more and more. And the actual thing which we can really get, and this goes exactly to what you were talking about, is the things with dog rescue and helping the community and helping others and making this podcast and being positive. That's actually bringing serotonin. So that's actually bringing this positive feeling in your body where you're feeling that connection with others. But that's because we're such a social species. That's the real buzz we get. And that's why I talk to people about, they're like, oh, your therapy job, you now must earn a fair bit. And I'm like, but what I really love is that I feel I'm helping other people's lives in the smallest way possible. So I've just gone off on like evolution and neurotransmitters and goodness knows what there. But that gives a bit of context why it's never as simple as just neurotransmitters. There's also the wider social, evolutionary and ancestral context to this weird thing that we call modern life.
Well, I love all that shit, man. I mean, I've been reading so much, especially this year. I've read more this year than probably my entire fucking 47 years of life on this planet. But the more personal development stuff that I read, the more I'm noticing there's all kinds of shit about the brain and the way things work that it's just crazy to me that nobody ever, I don't know, maybe I was kind of shitty in school, so they might have taught me some of this shit, but like, I felt like I've never heard any of this stuff. in terms of, I've talked about it before, a lot of people know that like, hey, I'm fat and out of shape. So if I eat healthy and I work out, my body's going to change. But it seems like not common knowledge that your brain can be changed as well. Like all the neuroplasticity and all that shit with like how you can build up myelin and all this stuff. Like that shit is so fascinating to me. So I like hearing all that stuff. And I wanted to see, can you explain the difference between dopamine and serotonin?
That's a good question, and this is challenging because this is keeping me on my toes. So people may have heard of serotonin because a common term is, oh, you've got depression, you've got low serotonin. Now, so that is something where, and you have mentioned it on a different episode where you were experiencing some stuff where you didn't feel good. You didn't feel great. You just felt like feel a bit rough. And what the medical system does, so if in this episode I talk about the medical model. So the medical model of care is the human body. It treats the human body like a machine, and the solution to everything is to fix it or change the oil, basically. So that's a metaphor for give you surgery or give you some tablets. So it's not really dealing with the symptoms. It's dealing with the symptoms, not the actual root cause. So what happened was, and from my understanding, is that serotonin was seen as something where if you've got a lack of serotonin, then that's why you feel depressed. So seeing it in a very simplified model of why someone might not feel good, but to give a more specific thing of what serotonin actually is, it's what's known as a mood stabilizer. So it helps your brain and body and your nervous system, because it's all interconnected. We can go into what the vagus nerve is in a bit, but essentially it's a mood stabilizer. So it can control your well-being, your happiness, and it's said that not enough can contribute to depression. Now, I was going to say this is the kind of shit that I watch in my spare time, but about what actually the neurotransmitters. So they talk about serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, and that's what common antidepressants are. And that's that idea that if you reduce the amount of serotonin that's reuptake passing from the one neuron synapse to another, there's a little gap, and then it kind of like sparks that energy in, and then it takes it back in. So it basically starts recycling the serotonin. But what that means is often it's then seen as, you haven't got enough serotonin. Now, that's a simplified way of looking at depression, but dopamine is something where it's excitatory. So just to recap, serotonin is a mood stabilizer. So it helps you to regulate your emotional state, but also it's a lot about connection and that type of stuff. Whereas dopamine is what you get released when you're doing what the human body from an ancestral perspective actually needs. So it's like sex, because you need to breed, finding food, movement, and it's essentially what's known as like a pleasure. It's basically a pleasure neurotransmitter, because it's like, oh, this is good, I want to do it again. And something like crystal meth or cocaine, which is stimulants, give huge amounts of dopamine to the system, completely blitz it. That's why you get that high, like that handshaking high. But again, it's like anything. If you use it too much, and crystal meth is a very big, that's like the heart. That's like a level where you would be, if you were doing crystal meth, then obviously you're very, very high. But using too much social media, it's what's called if I can pronounce it right, a dopaminergic response. So like gambling, pornography, the internet, computer games. And the problem is the more you use, it can get a bit fried out. So like your receptors, the more you give it, it's like, it's just worn out. And that's what a lot of people who have long-term, say, crystal meth or cocaine addictions, is that they actually then can't feel pleasure just doing things which are meaningful. But the benefit is, like you did mention, there's neuroplasticity. There's, the human body can change and regenerate itself on so many different levels, not just like the liver where it can recover from hardcore alcohol addiction. Like changing your lifestyle and changing the people that you hang around with and changing the things that you do gradually, slowly but surely, can bring about so much positive change. And if we think about dopamine from an evolutionary, so something that sparks dopamine gets our attention. It's also related to movement. That's why going for a walk can feel so good. You think, I can't be bothered. A 10 or 20 minute walk, I try and do it every day. I feel so much better. But like every neurotransmitter, it's like your motivation. Because otherwise, what's your push to do it? Like you're like, no, I can't be bothered to get up. I can't be bothered. No, I can't be bothered. Attention, focusing on things like that. So does that kind of explain what serotonin is and what dopamine is? Does that help? Does that give a bit more context, or have I just made it even more confusing?
No, it makes sense to me, and it's not something that I mean, I hear those things pop up a lot, and I never quite understood or took the time to figure out what the difference was, but it does make sense, and now that I hear those things, it'll be clearer, but I also did hear a lot about that. You have to be careful with doing things specifically to release dopamine. I mean, not even so much the drugs, but just if you find, I think I heard somebody talking about it, like when people try to hack the system in terms of your brain, and you try to do things to get these dopamine releases, and then it starts. I can't remember the way you worded it, but it wears out or something, or it takes more. And so I guess that's sort of how addiction works, right? You just start needing more and more. So if you get 100 likes on Instagram, that dopamine hit that you get from that, you're going to need more and more and more in order to keep getting that same reward over time. So I was wondering, like, how does that play in?
That's why it's potentially such an issue, is that our literally nervous system and the wiring of our brain and body pushes us to go into activities that release dopamine from a very basic need to be doing things. That's how, again, the wider context, that's how we've basically conquered this planet. Like, that's what I think, given that wider context, people are like, oh, this Toy Division guy's weird, but he's done loads of psychedelics. And I haven't yet, but I probably will when I can do it in the support of a therapist, because that's where psychiatry is going now, is that it's going to be, the era of psychedelics. So that's another subject. But I guess it's this whole thing of human beings are always pushing for more. Like, the reason why we've created jet engines, well, some of that was because of World War II, but that's another subject. But, why we're constantly innovating and changing the planet. And a lot of the times for the worse, but then now we've got people trying to change the planet for the better, because that's our drive. That's what keeps us moving. That's how we've moved from, like, basically a weird ape-type looking thing, or they reckon like almost like little rats running around, then change and evolve and then just create more and more things. But again, if you're just using, like, the example you gave is great. You get 100 likes, I remember when I first started an Instagram account 6 years ago, get like 2 or 3 likes. I was like, oh, wow. People like my photo. Now, if I don't get more than about 50, then I'm like, nah, pointless. And I know some people, they were saying that if they don't get enough likes, they just delete the photo. But that's a never-ending hamster wheel, isn't it? Because it's like, where does that bloody end?
It's a weird ass time that we're in. And like, I'm often really concerned about the idea that if you look at like how long humans have existed, the timeline that we're in right now, like, it's so fucking small. Like, it's like a blink of an eye compared, like, from when we invented electricity, like all the shit that we were doing before that, like no electricity, and we're making shit out of fucking wood and hammering metal and stuff. And then now we're in this time where, like, everybody has this infinite amount of information and shit. And I start to think, like, dude, we're not made for this, or we're not ready for this. And if you talk to my girlfriend, she'll go off on some like alien intervention shit, which, like, it doesn't sound that fucking far-fetched to me when you look at, like, we're basically living like, we're apes or whatever, we're like primates living out there with animals and shit. Now all of a sudden we're going to space and shit. And we got like fucking, it's crazy. This might be like way off topic, but so when, at the time, there was a moment when I was like, dude, the internet is really fucking dangerous. It was like I was painting in South Central, and there was these little kids. There was three kids, and one of them was maybe like 12, and the youngest one was probably like fucking 6 or something. He was really young, and they're like, I'm painting, and they're like, oh, that's cool. How do you paint over that hole? There was just a hole in the wall. And I'm like, oh, it's spray paint, so it just goes over the wall. And the littlest kid, the 6-year-old, was like, maybe it's a glory hole. And I was like, how in the fuck does a 6-year-old know what a glory hole is? And then I started thinking, like, this kid can look at porn.
Yeah, that's a serious issue. I think the pandemic of accessibility to things which are very dopaminergic and strong. So it's often referred to in the psychology literature in references that internet pornography is like crack cocaine of sexual arousal, because it's like you can just watch, focus like on a screen, and it releases dopamine, like high levels of dopamine. But then you can just be having like, you can flip from one clip to another and then to another and then skip back forward and do that and that and that. And you would never be seeing that shit in real life. You're never going to randomly come across fucking, no pun intended, you're never going to randomly just see like three like overly synthetic looking women like having sex with each other in front of you, and then you're like the point of view of that. That's, well, for some people it might do. Fair play to them. Shout out to them. They live in the fucking dream. But are they really? Are they actually a hungry ghost? Probably. You know, who knows? Anyway, but you know, that's the kind of thing where we wouldn't be seeing that. We wouldn't be experiencing that and getting that stimulus. It's just like a never end. And I always describe it as the hamster wheel. It's like, you know, when those hamsters, they start running and they're going and they're running and they're running, and it's like, oh shit, I can't stop, but I've got to keep this moving. I've got to keep going. I've got to keep going. I've got to keep going. And if you tie all that stuff in, where we're talking about graffiti, I was talking to a friend last night and I was saying, you know, I often have it where I'm like, I haven't done enough. I haven't painted enough. I haven't done enough trains. Because, you know, in the grand scheme of things, and again, this is the other thing that we do, and we can go into this, we always compare ourselves with others. Now, that's a dangerous thing because from a social evolutionary perspective, we compare ourselves with others. So the reason I was mentioning that, I was like, yeah, I try not to go on Instagram and look at graffiti stuff because I just keep thinking, oh, I haven't painted enough metros, and oh, I haven't done enough like rooftops, or I haven't done enough whatever. Oh, someone else has done more. And like, you'll be constantly comparing yourself with others. But that's what we do as humans. We compare ourselves with others. I was saying from an evolutionary perspective, compare ourselves with others because we were part of a small tribe. Small groups of 30 to maybe 50 people, you would know everybody. And that social comparison and that social awareness, something called neuroception as well. So reading someone's facial expression, tone of voice, and body movements is something which we would use as a sign of safety or danger. So me looking at someone's Instagram, and there's some people that put some really crazy graph stuff on Instagram, but I try not to look at it because I lay in bed at night and think, I've not done enough. I'm a failure. I haven't done enough trains. I haven't done enough rooftops. I haven't done a commuter train in like 2 years. I'm a failure in my life. And it's that social comparison, that default mode network part of our brain. So the default mode network is when you're not engaging in something meaningful. This is why I first learned about this through occupational therapy. It's like doing things of any type. It can be creative, social, emotional, all that type of stuff. But when you're not doing anything, your brain will slide into the default mode network. Now, the default mode network is the kind of part when you get into bed at night, you know, you've been kind of like busy all day, and you get into bed, you're like, oh, great, I can get a rest. And then it starts going, your brain goes, remember that time like 10 years ago where you like mugged someone off because you didn't want to talk to them? Remember that? You're an idiot. And then it jumps to the future and then goes, what are you going to do tomorrow? You've got all that work to do. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And it's like that toing and froing. But that default mode network is also the thing which does social comparison. So like comparing ourselves to others. So I'll often lay in bed at night and be like, that person's done more trains than me and I've not done enough, and I should have, why didn't I go and do that one panel mission when I got asked to do it, and why did I bail out on that? So it's like that's often the default mode network. But doing things like meditation, mindfulness, qigong, yoga, so I'm going to say Yoda then, yoga, I'm probably thinking of baby Yoda, because I've been watching Mandalorian recently, you know, doing that type of stuff helps strengthen parts of the brain to assist with that default mode network. And that's why it's important to be doing things and not be doing things which are dopaminergic slanted, so that you're actually getting fulfillment. You're actually getting, like doing graffiti, going painting. It doesn't have to be illegal, just doing something, sketching, drawing, going for a walk, meditating, breath work, all that stuff. Again, it ties in with occupational therapy because we take all those things for bloody granted. And then when we can't do them, we're like, oh shit, actually even being able to get out of bed, that was important. Being able to, like you said earlier, hold a cup of coffee. Because I do one of the things which I kept hearing recommended was writing a gratitude journal. I guess if you told me this 10, 15 years ago, it's a bit like any of this type of stuff I'm talking about now, I'd have been like, fuck off, you're well weak. What do you mean you do breath work? That's for toys, isn't it? That's for fucking toys. And, you know, before I really understood that, because I grew up in an environment where it was like, be a strong, tough bloke. Don't talk about your emotions. That's weak. And then especially when you go into graph culture, it's like, what, you cried because someone died in your family? You little weak bastard. So I've now completely changed that. I think maturity brings that. And I think I've heard you mention that as well, how you kind of realize you put on that persona And you're like, actually, I don't have to be this fake version of myself. Actually being a real person is the key. Each day I write a gratitude journal, and I'm happy to admit that. And, I used to do it where I write 3 things I'm grateful for. So I'll just read. So I've got sitting here. So it's like Tuesday, 15th of September, 2020. Number 1, I'm grateful for a place to live that is comfortable and safe. Number 2, grateful for food, water and shelter. 3, I'm grateful to be able to walk, talk, see and hear. Now people think, well, that's just writing stuff down. That's changing that mindset rather than getting up and being like, oh, fucking hell, I've got to do my emails and that person mugged me off yesterday and I've got to do that, I've got to do this, and like, just jump on the train and go to work and sit there and smash through emails, get angry on phone calls. Not to say I don't get angry, I get angry quite a lot, but trying to change that mindset of like, it's changing that mindset where actually life can be positive and changing that viewpoint. And gradually over time, those neurons and synapses create new thought patterns. And before you know it, you're not as much of a negative bastard sitting in traffic screaming at the traffic when you've got no control over the traffic, going, I hate fucking traffic and fucking hell. That's just me as a very stereotypical English person going, fucking hell, I fucking hate this traffic. I hope that gives them kind of an example of where it's okay to realise that maybe we're not all perfect human beings. And there's things we can do to change that. And especially in the graffiti culture, being a real open, honest writer, I'd much rather paint with someone like that than some like fucking tough guys like, how many fucking trains have you done? And you're like 30. I've done 200. And you're like, cool. What do you want me to say to that?
Yeah, there's a lot of, I think that was one of the things that kind of made me take a break from graph. There was a couple of specific things, but that sort of mentality is always hard for me to be around. And I wonder, I kind of feel like some of that is just, I don't know if it's necessary, but
the way I see it is there's a lot of young, angry guys who find graffiti as a subculture where they get kudos, they feel belonging. I'm not saying everyone that writes graffiti has like had issues with their parents or is from a family where there was divorce, what they call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So things like maybe a loved one or a parent was in jail, or they experienced violence, or they witnessed violence, or they had parents that were experiencing their own mental health issues. Because again, all this stuff influences the person that we gradually become. I always describe that as like we start off in the womb, almost like being 3D printed, like gradually being created. And our parents' nervous system, so how our mother is feeling, so the stresses in her life, how she eats, drinks, is she in an environment where she feels calm and safe? Is she overworking? Her nervous system is our nervous system as we're developing, that little 3D printing of that little entity, because we're connected by the umbilical cord. And then we're kind of pushed out and we're like, ugh. And the 3D printing's finished, the hardware's done, but the actual like software in that little entity isn't ready yet. We're not like a deer that pops out in a couple of days we can walk, or I was going to say a giraffe. That just sounds very much like a big deer, doesn't it? But animals, they will have their offspring and they still get looked after to some degree. But humans, we need those constant updates and those constant bit of software. So our environment, our social environment shapes how our nervous system. So are we scared? Do we feel safe? Are we scared? Do we feel safe? And I think that can be a bit overwhelming for people. So like, so my parents weren't very like supportive when I was younger. And, when my dad was really disciplinary, I'm basically just talking about myself. And I then thought that I was just really fucked up. But what it then turns out is because of the neuroplasticity we've covered and the ability to change and the ability to change ourselves as we get older, that little software update, this little entity can change and be really positive. And there is always some, chances for change. People that get talked about that, like, I talked to a couple of people on Toy Division. One guy who was like a hardcore heroin addict and he changed his life. And I think understanding that we all just need that positive input into our little system. And I think that can be so positive because there's a lot of angry people in the world for various reasons, but the majority of that is normally because things that happen in childhood. And that's not to say everyone who goes through childhood gets like seriously, significantly abused. That's obviously horrendous and such a challenging thing I work with quite a lot of people and a lot of children who face serious abuse and neglect, but realizing that we're all human beings and we all have parents and we all live in societies where sometimes it's not okay to talk about how you feel and it's like frowned upon. And that's often what I've thought about graffiti. It's like this subculture where there's a lot of young people predominantly male, who have issues with like emotional regulation. They don't feel a sense of connection. You know, it's not gangs. I know it's not the same thing as gangs, but it's like a big bunch of people where you kind of feel like they're your tribe. And trying to explain that over time you can change, it's often like, what do you mean? What do you mean, toy division guy? What do you mean I'm going to be like some weak yogi bloke who like does yoga and like does breath work and stuff? And I'm like, yeah, if you want to, because I tell you what, I'd rather do that than sit there just go, I hate this work person, I hate that crew, and I'll take them out, they're going down. Like, where does that really get you? Just more anger, despair, and fear.
Yeah, that's the stuff that, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to put this like why we even started this podcast in the first place, is just to, you know, I'm not trying to come out here and say like this is all shit that like I came up with. Like none of this stuff that I talk about, there's probably like a small percentage of shit that I came to the conclusion on my own. It's all just like taking stuff that I found that's helped me a lot and saying like, you know what, this information right here it helped me so much, and there's no reason why it can't help other people. And the people that I'm trying to look out for is the graffiti culture. So like every now and then you'll hear something like that our podcast isn't really about graffiti, but it's like it's trying to help people change in you know, stuff like what you're talking about. Like nobody really talks about that kind of shit. I can't say nobody, but like I don't hear it very often. Nobody talks about yoga and fucking meditation and stuff. But then when I do have these one-on-one conversations, a lot of times I find I talk to people that you wouldn't really expect do that stuff, and they actually do. They just don't really talk about it. But I think I know there's some value in putting it out there. I mean, just being another graph writer that's willing to discuss this kind of stuff. I mean, I think it's important and totally helpful, and trying to I don't really want to change the culture in terms of saying like the stuff you're talking about is wrong or right, like as far as that whole tough guy shit. I'm sure there's some kind of reason why that stuff is in place, but at the same time, there's a lot of people that are like me, I'm sure, that are in this environment that aren't really like that, and they don't want to just be like, I don't know, not so much like fronting like they're like that, but just sort of existing in that with that mindset, and I don't know, it sort of keeps you in that like not growing kind of phase, you know what I mean?
Well, how can you really become, you know, I look at someone like my grandfather who, you know, he's my relative. He's in his early 70s, and because of his childhood experiences, you know, my great grandfather came back from the Second World War, came back a totally different person, probably experiencing PTSD, but PTSD wasn't a thing then. It was just like drink some alcohol and get over it. And the domestic violence that happened in my grandfather's, you know, upbringing, him leaving home, I think he was like 8 years old when he left home. So that's very young. 8 years old, and goodness knows what he'd seen before. But you know, that then passes down into the parenting style of family. And I had to come to the realization that I had some serious, so I talked about being, you know, addicted to alcohol and drugs and that type of stuff, but I had some serious issues with my level of regulation. I get so angry so quickly and I'll fly off the handle. And this is where it's like, well, that's just being a tough guy, isn't it? I'm not saying you need to be some soft, like pushover. That's very different. You can be an intellectual, strong bloke, and sorry to people that bloke is man, because you know what a real man is? Someone who's actually able to be protective and actually look after others whilst also being strong, in touch with their own emotions. But it's just like, oh, fucking hell, what do you mean? You're like, you're saying you feel anxious? Oh, bloody hell. But the people that then react like that, they're often feeling that themselves, but they just don't realize it. And they deal with it through numbing. You know, they're being a hungry ghost. They're trying to they work themselves into the ground, or they just drink a lot. And I'm not saying there's anything, well, drinking is obviously not good for your brain. It fries your brain quite literally after a long enough time. But the idea that everyone needs to be this tough, strong bloke. Yeah, you can be a tough, strong bloke. Doesn't mean you have to be a pushover. But you know what? I'd much rather be able to talk to my friends and people that I know and clients that I work with about it's all right to not know what to do sometimes. It's all right not to feel safe. Because a lot of our reactions is anger is a response to feeling scared. So, we talk about fight or flight, and a predominantly male way of dealing with, you feel activated, otherwise often known as triggered. I try and use the word activated. Your nervous system, so that fight, flight, we've all got the other one, collapse, disassociation. But that's a whole other bloody podcast. We react by being angry. And then, after the fact, I think you mentioned it, another one where there was someone you'd like, look, guys, you can't drink here. You can't drink at the exhibition space. You just can't, because I don't want it to be associated with people getting drunk and drinking beers and stuff. They're like, yeah, cool. And then you saw someone pop a beer open and you're like, what the fuck are you doing? Who the fuck do you think you are? What on earth are you doing? That would have pissed me. I remember listening to that walking home, and I remember thinking in my mind, I would have lost my shit over that. But that's because that person is it's not because they're not doing what you want. Well, it is kind of, but it's you feel challenged, you feel activated, and you're like, that person is potentially a threat. So if we think about all this subconscious stuff, not that they were threatening you, but you've got this feeling in your body where running an exhibition in a gallery space, doing anything with a business can be really stressful. And the last little snippet of stuff is someone being disrespectful. But then after the fact, when your brain hasn't, there's a guy called Dan Siegel who describes the hand-brain model. So if anyone's listening to this, I'll just try and chuck it in. Hopefully it makes sense. If anyone's listening to this, you can just get your hand, put the thumb on the middle of your palm, and put your fingers kind of wrapping over the top of that thumb. So basically, it's like a really bad punching style throw. They're never punch like that. So if you can imagine, so where your wrist is, that's called the brain stem. So the brain stem is the most ancient part of the human brain, where that's your respiratory system, keeping your heart going. It's the super basic part of the brain. That's a whole other subject about the complexity of it. But where your thumb is, if you lift up the fingers and you look at the thumb, that's that little thumb in there. That's the limbic system. So there's other things to it, but one of the most important ones is the amygdala. So the amygdala is the little smoke alarm of threat. There's a threat there. There's something happening. And then also the little hippocampus. That's memory and that type of stuff, which actually hippocampus is really important to keep stimulated through exercise, which is one of the things you can do, and yoga and walking and whatever. Anyway, and then what happens is if you wrap your fingers over the top again, that's what's known as the most evolved part of your brain. The right at the front is the prefrontal cortex. What I was talking about was there's the hand-brain model. So you've got the hand with the thumb in the middle, fingers wrapped over the top. Anyone that's just tuning in it or just listening at this point, they're like, what the hell is this about? This isn't about graffiti, is it? But no, it's about your brain, and knowing your brain and your body can make you better at graffiti. Proven fact. So that hand-brain model, so the wrist is the brain stem. In the middle, the thumb, which is on the inside of the palm. There's the amygdala, the hippocampus, the amygdala little smoke alarm. Hippocampus is memory and that type of stuff. And then wrapping over the top, fingers wrapped over the top of that thumb is the prefrontal cortex, most evolved part of the human brain, which makes us able to do things like make jet engines and go into space and create the internet and vote in elections. So, but what happens is if you can imagine the analogy of the hippocampus and the amygdala, if they notice something, so it could be a taste, a smell, a sight, a sound, something reminds you of a memory of something, we're talking about PTSD as an example, that can be a bit of stimulus, so a sound, a smell, a taste, someone's tone of voice, the noise of someone moving in front of you, someone brushing past you. Your body takes attention, your brain and body takes attention. And then what can happen is that if you get distressed and overwhelmed, just as I'm getting people to imagine those fingers that are on top of that thumb just go upwards. So that it's not quite literally, but it's essentially known as flipping your lid. So the reason why I'm talking about that is, I've had so many times in my life, and I'm sure most people do, where you get angry and you say things and you do things, and afterwards you're like, what on earth was I doing? Why was I saying that? Why did I tell that person to go fuck themselves? Why did I tell this person they're a piece of shit? And I didn't really mean it. That sort of seeing red. That's because even though the evolved part of our brain is still online, it goes offline temporarily. It's still there. Like the amygdala is the horse, like a horse, and it's going along and everything's chilled. The person, the rider on the horse, is the prefrontal cortex, and everything's nice. Everything's chilled. And then that horse sees something. That amygdala notices something. Maybe it's like, this is like the movement in a hedge. It's a snake or something. That horse can bolt. That rider is still along for the ride, so the prefrontal cortex is still there, but that horse is off, and that prefrontal cortex is not in control. Now, the great thing about neuroplasticity is we can learn how to create experiences and inputs to make our prefrontal cortex more able to not control, but to counteract the amygdala just completely flipping out. And that's what, again, going back to the same stuff of like breath work, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, tai chi, mild to moderate exercise, eating well, sleeping well, hanging out with people that are in a positive state of mind. That's how we can strengthen our prefrontal cortex. And it's what's so refreshing is that, yeah, the brain can be, for whatever reason, your brain can be really challenged because of developmental or social issues, but we all have the ability to change. So I hope that then makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that has been the biggest benefit for me is knowing that you can change your brain and you don't have to be that way, the way that you are. Like I did a whole episode about not being stuck the way that you are and how just coming to that realization alone, not even knowing how to change or not even knowing any of the steps, but just knowing that you can make changes and your brain will actually change is huge. But I was wondering, is there an actual reason for anger, like biological or whatever? Like I can't find any good reason. Like that was one of the things why I wanted to not be angry anymore. And I've actually like read books on not getting angry, but I don't think I've ever come across any information that says like why it's there. Like I know why stress is there, and you talked about that earlier, but why is anger there? Does that help us in any way?
If we think about it from the scenario I've just talked about, so if you have a stimulus, something happens, maybe it can be, an explicit thing, so something which is happening at that time, we are, that's making me angry. But often we have a lot of, in our body and our brain and our muscles and our whole system, we have things called implicit memories. So memories which we don't even have in our subconscious. And that's often, the subconscious is actually more powerful than the conscious mind. One of the biggest myths that we're in control of our brain and our body. That's not saying we're losing control and like shitting our pants or like literally losing control of our body, but the subconscious does so much stuff in the background. And if you could imagine stimulus coming into the system, and in childhood, we learn how to get the attention and the safety and the care from our caregivers. So that's called attachment. So the attachment model, which is a big, big thing in child development. So it's like essentially going back to that more of like the old school ancestral thing of like the tribe. You'd be in a small group, you'd have multiple caregivers, you'd have like your mum, your dad, your brother, your sister, your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles in that small tribe, and they would be your attachment models. Because we come out of the womb, that little entity I was talking about, we come out a very vulnerable thing. We come out being, that's why babies cry, that whole model of like, leave the baby to cry itself out and then it will learn that it can't cry and get your attention. That's probably what my parents did because it was like the early 80s. But actually that goes totally against attachment. That baby is crying because it's terrified, and that baby needs you to pick it up and rock it side to side and feed it. And that's how we learn that the world is safe. That's how we learn that the world is, because it's a fucking terrifying place, really. When you're a baby, every sight, sound, taste, smell, everything is brand new. So that's what attachment is, and that's meaningful attachment. The problem is society has broken down attachment to be like, don't let that child be manipulative, teach them a lesson. That's where discipline comes from. Because then people think, oh, well, if, the old school was like, hit your kids, then they'll do what you want. But if you can imagine, that's quite a stressful thing. So then moving on from what attachment actually is, that's how we learn the world is safe, and that we learn that getting our parents' attention to get that safety is how we then develop our persona and a lot of our, not really persona, but our personality. So if we're used to having to be quiet to our parents because they're very quite strict and disciplinary, we have it where we learn to be quite quiet and timid. You know, children should be seen and not heard. Don't be very loud. Or if we can't get their attention because they've got their own stuff or they're too busy, we can get quite, doing things to kind of get attention. Hey, mom, this. Or a lot of kids can learn to actually being disruptive then gets their attention and gets that connection. But as we get older, that changes. So I'll use myself as an example. I had quite a disciplinary family and I learned to be very quiet. I learned to not really express my emotions. I learned to, I would be sent to my room, even if I cried, that type of stuff. And I was very timid and very shy and very quiet. And then the social context was that I was quite short and fat with glasses and, I was bullied quite a lot. So I was very timid and shy and scared of like being in trouble. I was terrified of my dad and my granddad because they were not really that much. My granddad's only 20 years older than my dad. But then I got to a certain age and I then realized I could take control of situations by being angry and being the aggressor. So when we're talking about anger, it's a different type of response. So we're talking about fight or flight, like the adrenaline, the cortisol. But as we change as a human being, and very often with men, male humans, or people that identify as well, but people that are male humans, we get to be then more of a dominant part of that relationship, that dominant part of that. I used to be terrified of my dad. And then it got to a certain point where I was actually bigger than him and stronger. And I ended up judo throwing him across the room. Now, that doesn't explain what anger is. But if you can imagine that there's a lot of people who get very angry. And this is what people don't like me suggesting is actually that's their nervous system being pretty scared. So anger is a response. Some people get very quiet and timid and just kind of want to leave. But for blokes, and especially if you're getting that modeling from, say, a parent or people in your social circle, is you learn, you don't let people walk all over you, but then that anger can just get worse and worse and worse and worse. And, my biggest thing is I don't want to be a husband to my now wife or a father to my kids where I scream and shout at them. I just don't want to do that. I don't want to be like that. I kind of love my parents, but they didn't really have those emotional regulation skills because then you realize as you get older, your parents are just winging it. They don't know what they're doing. They're just making it up as they go along. And that's been my biggest mission is to try and control myself and my anger and to then admit to my now wife, talk to her about how I feel and my emotions. I don't feel good rather than just taking it out on her. And if I ever slip out of that optimum level of arousal and go into, fight, flight or freeze or whatever, I see that now in a term of metacognition. So trying to look at why did I have that reaction? Why did I take that tone of voice? So for example, I have it quite often where she's my now wife I'll say something to her and she'll just go, yeah, cool. And I'm just like, who the fuck? What's she doing? What's her problem? What's going on here? Blah, blah, blah. But then the more and more I've learned is that that's probably a mismatch from my childhood where I'd be looking for that attachment. Because the other thing is which people don't realize is the older we get, we then start to, so I've heard it described really well, is in a relationship, that honeymoon period where everything's great, it's all lusty and cool and yeah, I've met this person, it's great, yeah, we get on so well, we don't have arguments. And then gradually over time, a year to 18 months around about once we get comfortable or we're it's more of a meaningful long-term relationship, that's when the issues start. Because then what we start doing is we start treating on a subconscious level that person with our attachment style from our childhood. So if the person is kind of they don't really attend to our needs, then we can feel overwhelmed and we can feel shut down and collapse, or it gets really complicated. But I just think that's so important. Why so many relationships break down after a year, 2 years is that it's almost like the buffering phase of the relationship is gone. And then you're mapping on a subconscious level those attachment models that I was talking about earlier, how your parents, were they attentive? Weren't they attentive? Were they disciplinary? Were they not disciplinary? Were they all about rules, or were they experiencing their own stuff and they couldn't really attend to you? Did they neglect you? Did they, all that type of stuff sitting there in our implicit memories, in our nervous system and our vagus nerve and our brain. And then we then go out into the world as these supposedly fully cooked humans that are that entity is fully developed. And that's why it can then be like anger, because it becomes our default like reaction. Or again, for guys, it's pushed out of us that we'll cry. Like if you're really scared, you don't cry. If you do when you're younger, remember I used to be quite a little crier, and I should just be mocked for it and told, don't cry, don't be a little pussy, don't be a girl, don't be a walkover, just like suppressing those emotions. And when people do that, that's a lot of reason why people end up getting long-term chronic mental health issues, because they can't express their emotions. They don't see that natural cycle. Does that explain why we experience anger? Was that just a very long answer?
No, it does. It explains why, but I'm wondering also just why, like if it serves any purpose, like, cause if you say, you know, if you're out, you know, pre-technology and all this shit and you're walking and you see a pile of tiger shit, you know, and you're like, oh shit, all right, I shouldn't be here, you know? So there's stress there and that makes sense. I don't know how, is anger there just for that whole fight part?
Yeah.
Like as far as
Yeah.
I'm talking about, like not in like our current modern thing, but like say you do come in contact with that tiger, is that where anger comes in, where maybe you get like so pissed off that tiger is about to kill you and you get adrenaline and you can defend yourself? Or is anger something?
That would be it. But if you think about the fact that we use words to describe human emotions, so this is the thing which someone explained to me a fair few years ago. They're like, you know, anxiety is a thing, but it's a word. Anger is a thing, but it's a word. It's a way that we have defined the human condition or the human responses using spoken language, because spoken language is something we all take for granted, but it's so mega complicated. So yeah, you're right. Like if we think about it from an evolutionary thing, we'll see a tiger, and in that split second, we don't have time for our brain. So going back to what I was talking about, the hand-brain model, if our brains needed time to really think through a scenario and think, right, I've just seen a really big giant cat running towards me. What should I do? Should I run? Should I grab something to hit it with? What should I do? Should I feign death? No, literally, it's like a snap reaction, because that's what keeps you safe. But the problem is that is our evolutionary thing, where it was like survival. But now our brain and our body hasn't really changed a huge amount since those ancestral times. So we're now in, you know, I mentioned earlier, segueing well to different things I mentioned, we're in a giant human zoo. So we're facing challenges and we're facing inputs that bring about that stress response, but actually they're not really life-threatening. So I find opening my inbox of emails, and you get an email from someone, and I can get so annoyed. And it's like, that's not threatening my life, but it's bringing about the reactions that would have been there for survival. Does that make sense?
No, totally. And that's kind of what I was thinking too, is in terms of like, we're built a certain way, and now all of a sudden we're in this crazy growth of technology and all this sort of shit that's coming along. And like you said, we're still operating on that same fucking whatever set of tools that your body has to protect you and to move you forward and want to keep progressing and all that kind of shit. But then now we're in this place where, like that guy opening the beer in my studio for the second time, my life isn't in danger, but like my ego is, according to my fucking primate brain or whatever. I mean, I read a book that said that the whole reason that you get angry, and I'm assuming he was only talking about in current times, is because your ego. So like if somebody cuts you off in traffic, you're not angry at that action. You're angry that motherfucker cut me off, you know, like Cub had said that. He cut me off. He knew it was me, you know?
Yeah.
And it's just some guy that wasn't paying attention. And the guy cracking the beer in my studio, I wasn't mad about that specific action. I was mad that he didn't respect what I asked him to do in my place. You know, it was my ego. And so I find it's easier to not get mad. I mean, I still have that where I get mad at shit, but it's a lot easier with that in mind, knowing that if you trace it back to like, okay, why am I mad? And you think about if it's your ego that's causing that anger, a lot of times you can make that connection like, oh shit, like I'm pissed at him or her or whatever because they said this to me, and it relates to me thinking, on that ego level, like I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does, definitely. But I think what's really important, and I think I totally agree with you, but I think also what's really important is to, like I've mentioned multiple times, and this is so much stuff is going on outside of that conscious prefrontal cortex level. That's like the insight afterwards when we're in that moment and when we're feeling that stimulus create that response. Sometimes we don't have control over it. Sometimes we go into that stress response or the shutdown. But what's really important is I was talking about metacognition. So seeing your thoughts for being thoughts, not facts. That's also very important. Our perception is just our perception. Doesn't mean it's not real to us, but it's like how we're perceiving a situation is influenced by so many factors. But there's the autonomic nervous system and becoming aware of that, how our body is feeling. So there's a lady by the name of Deb Dana who's doing a lot of work with Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory. So I'm doing some extra learning and stuff at the moment, listening to the audio book. And that's all about understanding your autonomic nervous system. So so she has what's called the Polyvagal Ladder. I'm just looking at the thing which I've drawn out here. The Polyvagal Ladder is like, are you in ventral vagal? So that's like safe, connected, autonomic nervous system. You feel calm, you feel regulated. Or am I in sympathetic, like mobilized, fight or flight? Or the more extreme version is what's called dorsal vagal. So that's like immobilized and collapsed. So it's basically feigning death. So that I think we should do a whole bloody episode about that. But also people like Peter Levine, Pat Ogden. So people check out Peter Levine, Waking the Tiger, or Pat Ogden, Sensory Motor Psychotherapy. For a long time, therapy was seen as something where it was talk-based. And talk-based can be great because that person that you sit with for an hour is almost being like a metaphorical container for your nervous system. So if you're in fight or flight, a lot of people are in chronic fight or flight, and we live our lives being just a little bit of stimulus sends us over the top. But being that like person who can talk, but Peter Levine especially brought to psychology that the body is so important. So how we feel in our body, and Deb Dana's stuff is about understanding how your body is reacting so you can then start to be more aware of it so you don't get taken off of that roller coaster of, oh God, this person. So what is it? Someone yesterday, I was standing in a post office and I was trying to stay quite far away, and there's a lot of stuff at the moment about staying socially distanced and this sort of stuff. And this lady just stood super close behind me and is talking on her phone. Now that's something I really don't like, people talking on their phone. And I was having to fight the response to turn around and say something like, do you want to stand me fucking closer? Or something like that. And that's, my life's not at threat, but at least now I'm able to then actually in the moment think. And what I do is, as I always suggest to people, is just try and breathe. The breath work, that's so key. Longer out breaths kick in that calm regulation. It's a bit more complicated than that on a biological and psychological level, but trying to just breathe and be in the moment and like focus on your body. And it's like, then I don't get into these situations because I turn around and go, do you want to get any fucking closer? She might have her husband outside in a car with his 3 other mates in a 4x4 who'll come in and kick the shit out of me all over the fact that I felt uncomfortable because she was standing behind me. So I guess it's this whole thing of empowering yourself to learn more about the human condition, but also being aware that try not to blame yourself when it doesn't all go perfectly. We can read all the books in the world and go to all the sessions, but if someone does something that activates our nervous system, we'll still get pretty pissed off.
I mean, I really like hearing that because it makes a lot of sense. Because when you think about, I think I read somewhere that there's a really high percentage amount of shit that happens in your subconscious. I think it was like 98% or something like that.
Most of it. Most of the stuff that's going on in your brain and body, you're not cognitively aware of. So you're not actually aware of like what's going on.
Right. So like in the case of being in the post office, I had the exact same shit. I mean, not exact, but I was in the post office and I felt myself getting pissed, you know, I'm in line and there's like all these people taking forever, like trying to pick what kind of stamps they want and all this stuff. And so I'm just standing there and I have this thing like trying to build up mental toughness and shit where I do all these little things where I kind of challenge myself. So business is really good. So I have 2 huge bags of packages that I'm sending out, but I'm like, I'm not going to put these bags down. So I'm holding like, I don't know, 40, 50 pounds. I have no idea. A lot to hold over like a 15-minute line where you would normally put it down. So I'm making myself hold these bags. And so I'm watching all these people like asking if they have these kind of stamps and those kind of stamps. And I can tell that I'm getting pissed, and the old me would have already been on fire. So I'm happy in that regard. I'm sitting there going like, cool, I got this. This is annoying as fuck, but I'm aware of it and I'm in the moment, like you said. But there's this fucking kid that's got these keys on like a lanyard or whatever the fuck that thing is called, a big long string, and she's just smacking the keys on herself side to side. So it's like the entire time I'm there, and the mom isn't saying shit. And so I just want to yell, shut the fuck up. Would you tell that kid to shut the fuck up? You know what I mean? But, and so like I experienced those feelings and there was nothing I could do but knowing and reading and doing all the things like that you're talking about, taking care of myself, being aware of that shit is going to happen. It allowed me to not do the things that I probably would have done 10 years ago or maybe less. So, I mean, it's good to hear that at least what I understand, I think what I understand you saying is that the stuff isn't in our control, that it's going to happen, but being aware that it's happening, that trigger or what's the word that you like to use? The activate. The activation is there, but your conscious mind is aware of it. So you're able to, you know, not suppress it, but control how you respond to that stimulus.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was talking about, metacognition. In that moment, you were able to use that prefrontal cortex part of your brain and think, this is not socially appropriate. This is not what I should be doing. And as you were describing it, I was just thinking in my mind's eye, I'd be thinking, shut the fuck up, shut the fuck up. The other thing you've got to be aware of is, and we all have to be aware of, is that girl with that, you say it was a little girl, right? With the lanyard, that's just that tiny little thing that you're seeing in your conscious mind. Like, that's fucking annoying. But there's all the other stuff of like, you're standing there, your body is holding that weight of that stuff. You're somewhere where there's quite a few people around. You've probably got other things you need to be doing. It's probably not exactly maybe, I don't know if there's air conditioning in there. I guess it's pretty hot where you are. It would be here. But, you know, there's all that other stuff going on that subconscious level. And then almost that last final thing is like that little kid with that fucking lanyard. If that kid doesn't shut up, I'm gonna. And then you're like, no, I don't have to. I don't have to be that person. I don't have to be that. Because that's the kind of thing. If I was there, so you're maybe going into more of like a sympathetic nervous system fight style reaction. I would have just walked out. I just leave. I've got a real habit of doing that. So I'll get somewhere and there's like a queue, and I'm like, nah, just walk off.
Yeah.
And I've really had to work with my wife to go, there's only about 2 or 3 people. So I turn up. I'm like, don't like it. And I don't really like very busy places either. And I've got a real sensitivity to sound because we haven't really gone through sensory processing either. But I guess we can save that for another episode. But what I'd really like to just say as we tie this up is that the main message from this, and I've gone into quite a lot of like potentially academic seeming stuff, but all this stuff, like you said, I didn't make any of this stuff up. I didn't find any of this stuff in terms of like doing the research. I just really wanted to understand myself as a person because I saw myself as really fucked up. I was a drug addict, nearly died twice, had a brain injury. Like, I was a chronic drug abuser of various types, drinking, like poor sleep, terrible mental health. And, you know, I changed my life gradually, slowly but surely, first thing was exercise and then trying to focus on what I ate and all that type of stuff. And I kind of got a bit disheartened with the medical model, like take some tablets and piss off. And like you said in another episode, it's like we can all be our own like champion and our own hero, and we all have the power to change. And passing on positive change to others is not weak. It's not like airy fairy fucking woo woo shit. It's really empowering to other people because, you know, if stuff has worked for me, like you're saying, I'm not saying doing this stuff is going to help everybody, but just knowing that you don't have to go to a doctor and take medication all the time. If you really want to change your life, you can. You can change what you eat. You can change how you sleep. You can change the people you surround yourself with. Maybe you've got a job and you fucking hate it. You know what? Can you just walk out one lunchtime? Can you just walk out? If you can, do it. Like, life's way too short to be working jobs where you're like, I hate this and I hate that and this is shit and that's shit. Even if it's well paid, what is that really bringing you? If you're rich and fucking miserable and stressed out and you can't sleep and you're arguing constantly with your family because you're stressed out, fuck that. Drop the mic and out. Boom.
All right.
Appreciate each and every one of you guys who are supporting the cause and continue to spread the love. And yeah, stay up.